Welcome to the Edges of Lean. I'm Bella Engelbach, and in this podcast we explore the human and creative side of lean thinking, unusual places where lean thinking is practiced. We meet people who are practicing continuous improvement in many different flavors and styles. So come along with me on a journey to the edges of lean.
Episode 21, Continuous Improvement and Conflict Resolution with Dr. Ted Thompson. Rector of Trinity Church, Swarthmore, and the Dean of Delaware County Churches for the Episcopal Diocese of Pennsylvania, Dr. Thompson holds a PhD from George Mason University's Curtis School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. As a consultant, he specializes in helping religious organizations work through difficult conversations and is working to build capacity for spiritually grounded conversation in the public sphere. Dr. Thompson also represents the Episcopal Church on the Interreligious Relations Table of the National Council of Churches. He's married to a retired FBI agent who's now a yoga instructor, and he has a 15-year-old son who loves baseball. Dr. Ted Thompson, welcome to the Edges of Lean.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
It's really great to have you here. And one of the things I like to do with this podcast is to bring in people who are not, really in the lean and continuous improvement world, because I think we can get really narrowly focused on, what we learn from one or two specific companies or one or two specific, lean leaders that we admire. And there's so much out there in the world that we can be learning from. And the work that you are doing and what you know about it with conflict resolution and, and the time that we're in right now, I believe is very, very important. And you have an interesting story about how you actually got into conflict resolution or academically learning about conflict resolution, hopefully not getting into too much conflict. So you were and still are an Episcopal priest, and you were the rector of a congregation. So first of all, can you explain to us what a rector is, what a rector does, and then tell us why did you leave that to go back to get your PhD in conflict resolution?
Sure, happy to do that. And by the way, please call me Ted. And I also want to say, Bella, that I've really appreciated getting to know about your work and in some ways seeing some situations, seeing you in action. And I feel like there's just a lot of overlap between what we're trying to do. So good to be with you. Yeah. So what is a rector? A rector is the senior pastor of an Episcopal parish. So in the Catholic world, that would be the pastor, or at least the senior pastor. We have other names for other sorts of congregations, but a parish is a semi-autonomous congregation, but within the Episcopal umbrella.
And so it's a spiritual role as a spiritual leader, right? But there's also an administrative role to it, and I'm sure there are financial pieces to it. So it is actually an executive position.
Yes, thank you for teasing that out of me. Yeah. Yes, there is administrative oversight. Certainly, there's responsibility for managing the worship life, being the primary personal pastor for people, but also sort of managing the organization.
But you left for a while.
I did.
Yeah. So how did that happen?
Right. So I was out west. I was in the San Francisco Bay Area. I had gotten married, and my wife and I had a son come into our lives. This was all post 9/11. And I suddenly found myself, or increasingly found myself, restless and more urgent about wanting religious organizations, and my church in particular, to do more to tackle the problem of violence in the name of God. I felt like at least my church, the Episcopal Church, had both more to give and definitely more to learn about how to be what I would call a partner in global peacemaking. And so I talked with the bishop about it, applied for a fellowship, got a church fellowship for it, and took off with my amazing wife and child onto this journey, which took us to Virginia and the George Mason University School for Conflict Resolution. Now it's called the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution.
After Jimmy Carter.
After Jimmy right. Technically, I think it's the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Yeah.
So it was not a seminary program. It was a secular program that you went into.
Absolutely. It's a public, it's actually the largest research university in Virginia. It's a large public institution, very secular in its orientations. And I think therein lies part of the interest in the story, because in academia as well, they're kind of trying to figure out what to do with religion.
Right. Yeah. And it's the same thing. I think we see, and I know, from your parishioners, you kind of see in the workplace, right? So people come in with a spiritual background or a religious background and may or may not be able to integrate that into their work. Right. Or be able to integrate that into how they're dealing with the world in a larger sense.
Right. So, can I just add that actually is part of the story of conflict resolution as well as it developed, because originally I think religions were seen much basically as part of the problem. And then in the 90s, there were some seminal figures who helped to ask the question, but how can religions be part of the solution? And how may they hold wisdom that could be mined toward all of us being better at conflict resolution? And that was part of what drew me into the work.
So you came in with the spiritual background, with a particularly theistic Christian background, probably a more progressive Christian background, and yet I'm sure you found there are these other voices in the field. So what are all of and I wouldn't say all of them because this would be a very long podcast. And what are some of the conversations or contributions to the study of conflict resolution that you learned about and that have shaped your work?
Right. You don't want to see the notes I have for that answer.
Don't read the notes.
No, I won't. Well, yes, part of the inspiration for even starting this very early PhD program in a field called conflict analysis and resolution, with an emphasis also on the word analysis, was the desire to create a real science around it. This was in the late 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. As I said, religion was very far off the horizon at that point as a potential source. Psychology held a lot of sway early on. Wargaming, this is Cold War. So wargaming scenarios in political science were part of thinking about things. People were learning from diplomacy and political science along the way. Dispute resolution, for instance, labor disputes, labor management disputes became a major source of study. And then over time, people began to wake up to the fact, along with the rest of the world, for the colonial critique, right? The need to get out of only a Western mindset for doing conflict resolution. So, for instance, a wonderful scholar, peacemaker, sociologist by the name of Jean-Paul Lederach did some work in Latin America and overturned that Western assumption that a mediator needed to be a third-party neutral person. He found that in a Latin American context, you really have to have someone who's embedded in the systems, because they're the trusted intermediate. They're the trusted intermediaries.
So there's a huge cultural component as well to it. It's
yes.
not just here's a series of steps that you can follow, and all people all around the world will just fall in line.
Absolutely. In fact, anthropology made a huge contribution to the field by bringing to bear considerations of culture. Kevin Albrook brought in the idea that culture really is a lens for understanding who we are and how we should relate. And later on, other people, Leslie Dwyer and others, have really continued to unpack what that means in practical ways for both seeing, understanding, and then working through conflict.
So one of the things that I'm wondering about, and you mentioned, labor management disputes, which is something that we see, I think, continually, whether it is union versus management, or it's this idea of management and then the people who are not management, right? And that we don't see things the same way. And what you're saying is it's not just that. You can't just say, well, this is labor management. In this particular instance, it's also, well, who are these people and where have they come from, and what might be driving their underlying beliefs and values?
Right. It's easy to think of culture as a monolithic thing.
Yeah.
But then that gets into stereotyping, and we have to be real careful about the labels we use, especially when we're entering into conflict, because in fact, conflict tends to want to push us toward labeling people. And so we always have to be trying to unpack those labels and sort of turn them on their sides and look at them from other angles. In fact, one of the things, another major influence in conflict studies in the past 10, 15 years has been to look at the stories people tell about conflict and the way that we get trapped by these stories into roles. So even using a label, labor management can tend to force that kind of a narrative. So exactly to what you're saying, to try to get, in a sense, behind that and look at and explore with the people involved who they are, what are the choices they're making, why do they care about what they care about, and how can we come to a common sense of not only what the problems are, but even what the questions are. That in and of itself, that approach toward moving toward common questions is a whole approach within conflict studies.
And what's interesting to me about that, and I'm sure to my listeners, is that in lean thinking, that's what we want to get to, right? We want to get to not necessarily what are the answers, but do we even know what the questions are? Are we asking the right questions? When we think there's a problem, do we even have any real understanding of what the problem is before we do anything to try to solve it? Yeah.
I think that's exactly on target for specifically thinking about conflict resolution. Conflict gets us moving quickly, thinking quickly. We get truncated answers. We think simplistically. And so slowing down and making reflective space and having sort of a roadmap for how to open up that space becomes really important.
So we've been talking about conflict resolution and your journey into conflict resolution, but we haven't actually taken a moment to define it. And so from your perspective and the work that you've done, from both an academic and a consultant perspective, how do you define conflict resolution?
Yes, it's hard not to tell the story.
Yeah.
And actually just have a definition. Conflict resolution has for a while was used as the umbrella term for everything we're talking about, but many people began to push back and say that it was too problem focused, and we needed to really think about conflict transformation, which is more relational, and takes a longer view often. So the language gets a little bit slippery. That's why I've adopted peace and conflict resolution rather than just the idea of conflict resolution.
I think certainly my knee-jerk reaction to conflict resolution is sort of the idea of mediation, and you think something, I think something else. We disagree. Right. We may not be physically fighting, but we're not in harmony with each other, and somebody comes and mediates and helps us arrive at a compromise, but that's really not what you're talking about is it?
Well, personally, I mean, mediation certainly fits within the larger scope of what is meant by the phrase. But what I'm particularly interested in is the transformational aspect of this work. How do we approach conflict in a way which brings us to a better community? Does that make sense?
Well, I think so, but do you have an example you can share?
I've been thinking about a lot of examples from my own work and the field of conflict resolution. And the truth is that conflict resolution is littered with seeming failures. There is a mentor of mine, Mark Gopin, who has devoted his life to working on the protracted conflict in Israel-Palestine. And he said at one point to me in a poignant moment, "I've lost every battle I've ever taken on."
Every single one.
But
he spoke about it as a battle.
But I think having had some years to think about that answer, I think I would challenge him and say, but look at how many times you have been able to bring people together. Look at how many groups of people you have been able to nurture and connect. Look at the voices that are now part of the conversation that wouldn't have been had you not been part of this. And those are all successes. There's a wonderful person in the history of conflict work, Elise Boulding, who liked to talk about what she called the 200-year present. And what she meant by that was that when you're in the middle of a really deep-seated, and we're talking about global, international type work, you have to be thinking 100 years back and 100 years forward. That the present moment is comprised of the longest lifetime of a living individual and the longest future life of someone born today. In order to really make space for both the histories involved, the culture we're talking about, the embedded practices and habits, and you could think about this in an organization as well, and also to think about how long it may be to work through some of the effects. That probably is a longer view than most organizational thinkers want to go.
Yeah, when you think of an organization, that has quarterly budgets to meet and annual goals to meet, whether they're a for-profit or a nonprofit organization, but that's actually important, right? That you're not thinking solely about what happens next week or next quarter or next month. You're actually looking forward, and you're also really being cognizant of history and where we come from and who have we been.
Well, let me jump in with, if I could. You asked it for an example, and I don't want to dodge that.
Okay.
So I've done a lot of study of the larger conflicts, but a lot of my consulting work really was in small organizations of religious nature, churches, various denominations. So in one situation, there was a conflict around a staff member, not uncommonly, it involves a music staff person. And in this case, a person was just not performing, and it was becoming evident that there were significant lapses. Well, it turned out that he was being asked to do something that he literally could not do. He had a condition that prevented him from being able to fulfill certain obligations as they had been written up for him. And so the success in that situation was to help people move away from blaming, help people move away from feeling like the only answer was for him to be fired, and to enter into a period of discovery about what the obstacles really were. First of all, get clear about where he was not performing, but also what the obstacles were to that, and then reposition his job so that he could do what he did so well, but not be burdened by things which he just did not have the capacity to perform. And
I gotta say, that sounds very much like some of the work that we would do in continuous improvement, where you really want to understand if somebody's not meeting goals. Well, first of all, are those goals, are they even important, reasonable goals, right? And secondly, is there something in the system that's preventing them from achieving the goals. But primarily, before you even get to that, is to step away from blame, because blame makes it very difficult to get anything solved. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, if you're listening to if you're listening to people tell stories about conflict, you can kind of judge how serious it is by how simple the story is to some extent, how simplistic it's become, and also how much denigration of the other is going on. Right. So if someone is still able to hold space in the way they tell the story for the other person maybe having made a mistake or just not been successful, that's one thing. But if they've gotten to the point of saying that person is just a rotten person, he always is lying, he's always doing this and this, that's a character. That's a level of assuming a character flaw. And that's very common, actually. If conflicts don't get solved, people usually devolve into sort of harder and more crystallized views of trying to make sense of why the other person is not meeting their needs. And that has to get unpacked.
Yeah, and so people are then personalizing the problem to a person rather than trying to, or being able to see what might be some of the things that are actually causing it.
Right. At the systemic level, right.
So I hope you don't mind me asking this question, but it just occurred to me because of previous conversations that that you and I have had in continuous improvement. We talk about learning cycles. Where you start with in one place with your knowledge, and you go through a series of steps, including probably running some kind of an experiment in order to enhance your knowledge. So we always say we say plan, do, check, act. So you make a plan about what you want to do. You do it, which is to run the experiment. You stop and you reflect on what actually happened. What did you learn before you make it? You decide what your next act or adjustment is going to be. And so that, that's a very simple learning cycle. But I know that in your work that you have talked about this sort of being actually a double loop. This is probably a hard thing to talk about in a podcast because we can't show any pictures for the people who are just listening. But I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just for a few minutes talking about what is this double loop, and how is it different from PDCA?
Sure. So let me back up and just say, I suspect most people who go through any kind of a management program these days get something about how we learn, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I got out of seminary was the idea of an action reflection model, which is, I think, which you've helpfully differentiated in the learning loop that you have, right? That seems to be the way that adults do best, learn best. The double loop you mentioned comes out of what is called the insight approach and grounded in the philosophy and theology of Bernard Lonergan, a theologian, mid-20th century theologian and philosopher. What he was interested in doing, what he actually was convinced needed to happen, no less than to help society move forward in a positive direction, was to figure out what could connect the way that some people want to hold to truth that is handed down, sort of the classical mindset, and other people want to understand truth as it evolves historically and culturally. So this is a constant tension in our society, right? It's the way my fathers gave it to me. That's the way it should be. No, that's just your culture, my culture. And what Lonergan discovered was that when we focus on the questions, there really are some inherent questions in the way human beings do problem solving. And the questions are very basic. It's like when something catches your attention, what am I noticing? And then how do I make sense? What do I construct that to mean? How do I understand that? But that's what you might call the lower loop or the first loop. But on top of that, there's a loop around valuing, because once you decide what is the truth, then you have to decide, what am I going to do about it? So it's a very decision-oriented process where we have to say then, well, what do I think of what's happening? Is it good or bad? What is my obligation to that? What are the options around that? And what am I actually going to commit to? And it turns out that basic set of double loop is inherent pretty much in the way, at least, that we can approach any significant problem. We don't have to usually go through it with consciousness because we have habits that serve us. But when our habits don't serve us, or when there's a breakdown, either personally or communally, it's very helpful to return to that sense of those basic questions to figure out where things got stuck.
So I can think of a situation, and again, this is more of a situation happening in the organization, where the people actually have two different conflicting sets of values. So supposing one person has a value of ensuring that the people who work in the organization are paid sufficiently, and the other person has a value of making sure that the organization is not spending money that it doesn't need to spend. And so they might say, well, now might be the time to lay somebody off. And another person might say, well, let's hang on and, see if things get better because we shouldn't be laying people off right now. And so they could get, and I've certainly seen this situation, they could get quite passionate about these two things and if not being really clear in their minds about what is the value that is behind this. In this case, these are probably more of organizational values, but we know one is saying people's jobs should be preserved. That's important. And the other is saying, no, the life of the organization and its ability to continue financially should be preserved, right? And now they're in conflict. And so they could, certainly get into a big conflict about that, and not be able to resolve it if they are not thinking about the values behind, why am I saying those things? That's just the way I believe it is. I really believe people shouldn't be laid off, or I really believe we need to preserve the financial health of the organization.
I think that's exactly right, Bella. And I like how you talk about getting behind that sort of surface level statement about what they value, because I would say in some cases I would maybe change the word. I'd say that is what you have concluded is the answer, is the decision. Lay people off is not a value. Lay people off is a decision.
Right.
And you have to get behind that and say, now, what are you trying to achieve from that decision? And then you begin to be able to unpack the realm of values. And very often, I think if you go back far enough, you realize that people have shared value, right? They have shared valuing, but they see different pathways. And therein lies a lot of space, I think, for some creative problem solving.
Yeah, but there's also space there for people to sort of in retrospect make up the reason why they feel this way if they haven't had the opportunity to really reflect on why they feel a particular way.
Say that again. When you
so one of the things that I've observed in my work is that when people are faced with things, particularly things that are uncomfortable to them, they have their reaction first, and then not understanding why they have the reaction, then they and it's not that they're lying, they come up with reasons as to why they behaved in a certain way.
Right. And I think that goes to the central importance of creating the conditions where people can become increasingly self-aware and honest, because we can lie to ourselves. We can fool ourselves is a better way of saying that. We can fool ourselves. Especially when we're afraid of looking bad, right?
Yeah.
And so I think at some point talking about how to create those conditions might be helpful.
So now you are back working as the rector of a church. You moved to the other side of the country, and you're doing other work as well in the diocese that your church is in, and also with interfaith work. So what you've learned about conflict resolution, how have you been able to integrate that back into your working life? And
yes, I was thinking about that in advance, and I realized that I need to preface any answer by saying that I think it's flowed both ways.
Yeah.
And there was actually a nice moment of realization for that for me, because that's what I've always held out, right? That the learning is both ways. There are things that I learned really through church and spiritual practices that I brought into conflict resolution, and vice versa, things that I've learned through the study and practice of specific methods and approaches that have informed my work as a priest. I've said a few of them already, but let me just sketch out a few, maybe in a more helpful way. The first, I think, would be to realize that we are all trying to solve our problems all the time. And we are making decisions based on what we know about ourselves and about our worlds, and we are going to make mistakes. And so it's very helpful to learn humility about that and honesty, and then as much as possible, bring that back to the organization. So to admit when you've made a mistake, or just when you've learned something. Gosh, I didn't know that. And that helps to create a climate, a learning climate. I think you and I have talked about how you've got to allow space for failure if you want to have a creative organization that's willing to take risks.
Yeah, definitely.
I mentioned Elise Boulding and the 200-year present. Even in small ways, I've learned to take the longer view. I remember when I was a priest early on, something happened. I didn't do something the way someone wanted, and the person was mad at me, and I thought the relationship was ruined forever. Life is ended. I should go to another congregation. And then that family needed a priest to help her son get married, right? And I invested in that. I became a pastor to that son and to that family, and all was well, right? And that leads, so holding out the real hope that there will be other chances, right? Chances for repair. Also, remembering the relational aspect, and I like to think not just of conflict resolution, but conflict prevention. That as much as it's good to have skills to be able to resolve issues, it's even better to prevent conflict from happening in the first place. And one of the ways we do that is by having well-rounded relationships with people. So I'll tell you a story from the realm of global politics. So this was a story I was told at a party. I've never seen it written down, so how apocryphal, I don't know. But the story went something, and the details are a little fuzzy, but the story went something like this. This is the time of the Camp David Accord, right? So Anwar Sadat, Menachem Begin, and Jimmy Carter. It was not going well at Camp David. And one of them was about to leave. I think Begin was about to leave. And so Jimmy Carter reached into his pocket, and I'm making some of the details up here, but the kernel is there, and pulled out a picture of his grandchildren. And they got to talking about grandkids. And that turned the conversation, because suddenly it wasn't about where they had been stuck in the negotiation. It was about what kind of world are they trying to create for their grandkids. Right.
Wow.
So to reach for that human connection with someone in the moment if necessary, but also to be building that with people, just creates such a richer field for, I think, living in organizations and in community the way we want, and then dealing with issues when they arise, right, in a healthy way.
And I can see, I can sort of imagine Jimmy Carter doing that in a way that's very authentic. It's not you couldn't imagine that Jimmy Carter would pull out a picture of grandchildren in order to manipulate people.
No, and it may have been that he pointed to a picture of Menachem Begin's grandchildren that Begin had put on his dresser. I'm not sure exactly. I've lost track of the question to some extent, but I'm happy to just keep going about things that I find useful. So things that I find useful. When you're in charge of an organization, it's easy to feel, as one should, responsible. But there's a difference between being responsible and being in control, right? So learning to share control, which I think most of your listeners will know. But especially when there's conflict, it's challenging because part of the issue is trust, right? So taking that risk to figure out how to share a bit of control with the people with whom you may have a disagreement, right? Or a lack of understanding. And I'll give another example. There is a wonderful Palestinian peacemaker by the name of Aziz Abu Sarah. I met him when he was at the school, but he's now moved on. He does Mejdi tours, by the way. He developed, along with Mark Gopin, one of my mentors, what they called the dual narrative approach to taking people to Israel-Palestine. The idea was that if you just take people to Israel-Palestine and give them one side of the story, what you're doing is you're creating polarization. If you can bring them into that environment and tell them both sides of the story in a compassionate way, you're creating a community with a shared understanding. And so I think organizationally, to figure out ways to make space for a shared story to be developed is critical in conflict work. Sometimes it's called building a better story or building a better narrative. Creating a shared narrative and one that has hope at the end of it, rather than a narrative where the only win is for someone to leave. I talked about stories. I would just underscore the idea of listening to help people tell their stories, especially in conflict, listening for how they're positioning themselves in that story. How much self-awareness do they express? How much room are they leaving for other people to be persons of integrity? How defensive? You can learn a lot. You can get a lot of clues about what needs to happen next just through listening to how people tell the story of conflict. And then I would also say it's important to figure out how intervening in one area, I would say helping in one area, is going to be good for the whole. I'll tell you why I think of this. Another story from global politics, the Oslo Accords, all right, generally thought now to be a failure, to have failed. Again, this is Israel-Palestine. The post hoc analysis of that was that these wonderful accords had been written among elites, but there hadn't been work on the ground to prepare people to embrace what the leaders had decided. And so if the whole sphere, organizational or nation, if you will, isn't somehow being prepared, things can fall apart. And also, just in general, if there's intervention on one side of a conflict to lift people up, the people on the other side of the conflict often experience that as a threat unless they're also brought
They,
along.
they looked it up as well. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So those are some of the things that I don't actually have to use that much because we have in my current life as a congregational pastor, but I keep in mind as a conflict person.
I think those are all actually very important for people who are working in organizations where you have been brought into the organization or asked in the organization to help create change, to create a transformation in how people work, because all of the things that you're talking about, result in the ability to actually complete the change and have it truly be a transformation, and not be yet another story about how the organization tried something and couldn't do it. And the nugget for me that that really shone that I think that we could certainly think about more and work more on in the work that people who are doing lean thinking and continuous improvement is this idea of listening, not for just what the story that people are telling, because we do that, we go and see what's actually happening. We ask people what's actually happening, but what you said about listening for how they're telling it and where they see themselves in the story, and then helping to create a narrative where they can be successful and other people can be successful. It sounds to me that would really build a change management approach that would be stronger, because you wouldn't see people standing on the side and say, well, they came in and they did this and they took away that, and they I don't get to do this part of my job that I loved, I previously loved, and it's about me versus them, but it's about I was listened to and I was really heard, and I know I was heard because the person who was listening listened to how I was telling the story. So I think there's a lot actually to unpack there, and I wish that we had more time today to talk about that, because I think that is just a gem for thinking about how do we do this.
That, by the way, in the field, that's called positioning analysis in the narrative approach, in case anyone wants to look it up.
Okay, good. Positioning analysis. Look it up if you're interested. Right. Well, we only have a couple of minutes, Ted, to wrap up here, and I would just love in the last couple of minutes, if I'm thinking about young people who are studying their careers, whether that's in a nonprofit world, in a for-profit world, in a secular world, in a faith-based world, as they're starting out in organizations. And this is not just from your work in peace and conflict resolution, but from Ted Thompson, your whole life. What advice would you give that young person starting out?
My son is not so far off. I mean, he's 15, so he's not making a career choice yet, but it's not going to be too many years before he's choosing a college major. So this gets personal.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. Yeah.
One thing I didn't say earlier about lessons that I think fits here would be not to underestimate the need to take care of yourself. That being a change agent, seeking to initiate change, dealing with conflict, it is a whole body and mind endeavor, and it costs. So to take care of your body and your mind and your spirit, really be attentive to that, is one of the best ways that you can be effective and remain effective for a whole career. I guess I would also say, that, and this is sort of the hold yourself lightly type of comment. You will make mistakes, so some that bear good fruit, some that don't. Try not to get stuck in one way of analyzing what you're doing in an organization. Engage others in asking what they see. Allow yourself to turn the problem around and see it from different angles and even with different approaches. And then just keep coming back to those basic questions. What is true? What is good? And then allow yourself to be nurtured from your spiritual sources. What your sources of strength and love, and you'll be on the path for wisdom, and you will be a blessing for others as well as yourself.
Wow. Thank you. Well, thank you, Ted Thompson, for journeying with me to the edges of lean. I've enjoyed this conversation, and I think that there is a lot to learn from the field of peace and conflict resolution when it comes to making both organizational change, but also change in society. And there's so much that's needed now. So
Bella, you made this delightful and not nearly as scary as I thought it would be.
Oh, good.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Good to be with you. Bye, everyone.
Bella Engelbrecht, and I'd like to thank Dr. Ted Thompson for being my guest on The Edges of Lean. What have you learned from listening to Ted about conflict resolution? I'd love to hear from you. Find me on LinkedIn or comment wherever you watch or listen. And no matter how you travel to the edges of lean, your ratings, reviews, and comments are greatly appreciated. Please join me in exploring more of the edges of lean. There's a lot to learn. And check out my friends in the Lean Communicators community at leancommunicators.com. You'll find more podcasts and videos with lots of great new content every week. The Edges of Lean is written and produced by Bella Engelbrecht. This is a Lean for Humans production.